Is there any effort to coach your startups in developing a portfolio for defensive purposes to deter anyone else from trying to monetize against them?
Yeah, so this is something that, as Michael knows, and as Myron knows, and Roger, the world that I came to before tech transfer, most immediately before this, I was with an investment bank, a transaction advisory firm called Blackstone IP, and we did a lot of advising clients on defensive acquisition of IP for this purpose, right? So I teach a class at UK College of Law students and business students, and we have one whole class about ways to clear risk, right? So I talked about that decision of getting into market, but there's different ways you can clear risk. You don't always have to approach the person with the problematic piece of IP and ask for a license. And in the big tech world, oftentimes it's not directly approaching the problem; it's actually indirectly acquiring a defensive position, which would be IP that could be used offensively against the person that has the piece of IP that you're concerned about. And then it just becomes a balance of payments discussion right at the table. We have 200 million of exposure. We bought this other piece of IP that you have 200 million of exposure, and it's just a balance of payments or a cross license if you want to.
Good old days.
That's right.
But that's why Myron brought up what the issue of use or not use really shouldn't be a moral issue about whether you're a good patent asserter or a bad patent asserter, but it's become completely embroiled in that. You're talking about a situation in the old days where a Panasonic and a Samsung would have a giant fight, and they'd go on for a while, and they'd posture a bit, and there would be some money spent on lawyers. But then ultimately they'd count up the units, and they'd look at their portfolios, and somebody would pay somebody else a check, and they'd go on. But now we have companies that have very big portfolios who there's no counter assertion against, and it's a fact, but it's not necessarily an improper use of that IP or a moral issue or anything like that. I mean, and that's how the troll conversation, I think, gets put forward, is you make those people who aren't using the patent look like it's bad for them to assert it, when it's not necessarily a bad thing, other than for the person who can't countersue them. And I'm not sitting here trying to defend trolling per se, but I also don't think it's very different between a patent pool, which is a very pro-market good thing, and a university, oftentimes, who even puts patents in a patent pool or into an entity that's asserting. I don't think that this should become a moral issue of whether do you use that patent or not. It should be somewhat irrelevant.
One of the challenges is that in certain fields, pharma, material technology, semiconductors, patents and the use of those patents are known to be valuable and enforceable. I think in the sort of software AI world that I spend a lot of time in, and I mentor and work with startups, my advice to them is revenue and customers is what's going to make you successful, not your patent portfolio. And if it ends up to the point where you're trying to enforce your patent portfolio or sell your patents, it's probably not a great scenario. Twitter had one patent application when they filed for their IPO. They ran fast, they had hundreds of millions of customers, and so there's proof that you don't necessarily need a patent portfolio to have a successful business and to go public. I would say that patents should be part of the equation of the assets that you're building. But as Michael said, since 2011, 2012, the enforceability of software patents in particular is gotten a lot harder, and there's a lot of vehicles for some of these infringers to fight your patents. And so I would just say, I would keep my eye on maintaining your patent portfolio, adding patents to it to fortify, but customers and revenue will lead you to a much better outcome.
Yeah.
Question on that. So you're advising an AI company, right? I've seen this. We do a lot of work with a startup accelerator in Manhattan, and it's almost like patents to some VCs. It's not about assertion. It just shows a level of sophistication, right? It's like filing a Delaware LLC, right? It's not that it's that there's a bunch of companies, and maybe for MIT it's not that. I mean, candidly, it's not the same because it's such like the cream of the crop. But when you have, in my experience, you've got multiple companies oftentimes doing similar things, right? So it's kind of like, well, what sets apart one company from another? And I've seen instances where a software company that arguably shouldn't have wasted their money on the software patent because it's not enforceable, it's probably not valid, it's probably a waste of money though, have gotten the funding deal because they say to the investors, well, we filed 8 provisionals, right? And the investors are like, oh, that's impressive. They're sophisticated, right? And it's like it's this almost intangible value that it adds to the enterprise. It's not at all related to whether the IP is enforceable. Like, do you see that? I mean, or is
Sure.
that, is that
I mean, I think certain investors have a checklist, and on one hand, they're like, oh, I don't need university IP, and why do we have to do this license, and it's too much. And on the other hand, it's like if you don't check the IP box, you're not going to move to the next level. So there is, it's a paradox, in sort of how people view going forward. Again, I come back to, patents, especially in the software area, can be very valuable. If you had the search algorithm that Stanford had for Google, that was great. But because of detectability, because of all kinds of other issues, I think it needs to be having a good patent story, or why you don't have patents is, I think, something that an entrepreneur needs to be able to answer. We see, there's open source has built Red Hat and a lot of other companies on top of open source, and that's certainly a viable path to go, which is to, and we are seeing more and more activity. We're one of the few TTOs that actually takes disclosures for open source to try to keep ourselves and the folks disclosing it kind of out of trouble. But that's an alternate viable path to market and to commercializing software inventions.
I think why you see the renegotiation, I think we're going to talk about it a little bit later, but I just, after Myron saying that, I got to touch on it a little bit. But what happens is there is a certain, I've got a patent, and so I'm going to get venture capital. If you start early stage, the money generally becomes much more sophisticated. So the first round is going to be probably friends and family, fairly unsophisticated knowledge, and not real demanding. They they see a patent, maybe not. Series A, probably, they're going to look for some IP, and they're not going to look at it very closely. They're not going to look at what it does. Series B, suddenly that's when I think people might come back to universities to talk, is now they're getting questions about, hey, what about this royalty burden, or do you really have the rights you think you do, or this isn't really reading on your product. I mean, they get very, very sophisticated later. So it's not a check the box down the road. I wouldn't want people to go into it thinking that. It's kind of a check the box the first couple of rounds. There you're safe. Just have a patent. But beyond that, people care.
I don't want to monopolize this, but I will tell you, we asked, Rob had asked for some success stories, and one of my portfolio, one of the inventors that I work with, co-founded a company called Inkbit, and that company just raised $12 million in strategic financing. They do AI for 3D printing and a printer. And I can tell you that every single one of those strategic investors, DSM, Stratasys, 3M, Saint-Gobain, all inspected the patent portfolio before making that investment. So depending on the market, and this is AI, it's AI and software based. So, I mean, we can talk in generalities, but I think a lot of this really depends on the team, the market, and in the old days, people used to do freedom to operate, right? People actually used to go see what patents they might need in order to pursue the business that they're pursuing. So
I think so. But the problem in championing like what Twitter did is because what people don't actually realize is that when Twitter went to market with one patent, as soon as they announced their IPO, IBM knocked on their door and forced them to pay $35 million to buy patents. Pure Storage tried to do the same thing. IBM knocked on their door and paid $100 million. Google did the same thing and tried to get to market and gave $350 million in equity to Yahoo.
But they had the money to pay it.
That's true. It was public market. I guess the investors paid for it. And Facebook did the same thing. But I mean, all that, those are stories that I like to tell people know those names. But at our level, right, when we're spinning out a startup that has a single patent, I still think what I said before, you're 4,000 times more likely to raise capital based on the signaling of having a patent versus not is worth it.